Hello and welcome to this special event at the Catholic University of America. We are calling this event Finding the Sacred in Art, a conversation with Stephen Auth and Dony McManus. My name is Jacqueline Leary-Warsaw, and I am the Dean of the Benjamin T. Rome School of Music, Drama, and Art. We are here today on the campus of Catholic University in Salve Regina Hall, which houses our Department of Art. We're thrilled to have in our audience Catholic University art students and the president of the university, Dr. Peter Kilpatrick. And joining us online are art lovers from throughout the country. It's my pleasure to serve as the moderator for this discussion with Stephen Auth and Dony McManus. And let me say that the Rome School is honored to host today's event because we are committed to the understanding and creation of sacred art and its role, both past and present, within the Catholic Church. When we look at a beautiful work of sacred art, we can see the shapes, lines, colors, tones, and textures that the artist so skillfully uses to create a certain aesthetic. But sacred art can also be a powerful tool for prayer, reflection, and growing one's relationship with God. So this is what we're going to talk about today. It's going to be a discussion between one who is an artist and educator, whose life is dedicated to the creation of sacred art, and a connoisseur and art lover who has gone on a spiritual pilgrimage with art through the ages as the touchstones of his journey. I'd like to now introduce you to our guests. Stephen Auth has had a long career on Wall Street. He serves as Executive Vice President and Chief Investment Officer of Equities at Federated Hermes. He earned his undergraduate degree at Princeton University, where he graduated summa cum laude, and his graduate degree at Harvard Business School, where he was a Baker Scholar. Steve is a frequent guest on television networks such as Fox Business News and CNBC, and he has twice been profiled in Barron's. Steve is a member of the Regnum Christi movement and sits on the national board of the Lumen Institute, which he helped found in New York. With his wife, Evelyn, he has led the New York City Street Mission for 14 years. Also with his wife, he leads the popular spiritual tour of the Metropolitan Museum of Art called Man's Search for God, A History of Art Through the Prism of Faith. And he serves on the board of the National Office of the Pontifical Mission Societies in the United States. Steve is the author of 3 books, The Mission. He also holds a Master of Fine Arts degree from the New York Academy of Art and a master's degree in Architecture, Art, and Liturgy from the European University of Rome. Dony has maintained studios in various locations throughout Europe and the United States. In 2004, he established the Irish Academy of Figurative Art, and in 2007, he created a sacred art studio in Florence at the Monastery of San Marco. Upon an invitation from the Archbishop of Florence, Dony founded the Sacred Art School of Florence in 2011 with a mission to teach and produce art in service to the Church, both devotional and liturgical. In recent years, Dony has focused on large liturgical art commissions, and his work can be seen throughout the world. Dony is Catholic University's first artist in residence. He teaches classes in our Department of Art and maintains a working studio right here in Salve Regina Hall. Join me in welcoming Dony McManus. So Steve and Dony have each chosen 2 works of art that they will discuss. So, gentlemen, I now turn to you.
excited I am to be here. I've spent my life studying art, and my wife likes to say, Steve, you got to tell people, you're making some of this stuff up. Maybe there's some conjecture on what's going on inside the mind of the artist, certainly when you're understanding art, but I've never had the opportunity to be in an artist studio with one of, a world-recognized artist, and Donnie and I have spent a lot of time talking about this presentation, so it's just been really a joy for me to meet Dony and be part of this. So, and so I actually curated a few pieces to bring that I thought would speak to you, and maybe get things going. And one thing is that when you write about what you do, you talk about how you pray so much in the process. And I really identified with that because when I wrote The Pilgrimage to the Museum, every page was a prayer before I actually wrote it, And so I was thinking about that. And I was thinking about the tradition of icon painting. So this painting here to the right by Berlinguero, it's actually, oh yeah, thank you, Donnie, yeah. So we can paint it over here, the Berlinguero. Yeah, it doesn't show so well. So, but you're on the right. And, this is an Italian painting, but really it's a Byzantine origin. It was painted in 1230 AD. Just when that happened, a lot of the Byzantine icon painting from Constantinople was flooded into Europe, and particularly into Italy. And the Europeans quickly adapted the style. And so this is a very traditional icon on the right of Mary showing the way, so to speak, and the way being Jesus. So the thing about the Byzantines and the Middle Ages in general is that the artist isn't trying to display the physical, the present. They're trying to bring us to the eternal. And so that's why the art is two-dimensional. It's purposely done that way to portray that we're not in Peoria. We're somewhere in heaven. And the gold backdrop is another way of symbolizing heaven. And so this is kind of abstract in a way to try to designate that. And it's a prayer. It's Mary telling us the way is Christ, and she points to him. And if you notice little things about Mary, as an example, her eyes are large. So that's why, to let us know that she's always watching after us, and we can appeal to her. Her ears are larger, as are Christ's, than a normal person's ears would be, the bigger to hear our pleas, right? And her lips are pursed and quiet to remind us in prayer, this is something I don't do too well, to listen instead of talk, right? Listen for the word of God. And then she points to Jesus. I could go on a lot about the Berlinguero, but I wanted to take you briefly to a revolution in art that occurs 70 years later, and that's the Duccio on the right side of the slide here. And I think a lot of you would look at this and say, well, Steve, I don't get it. I mean, these are almost identical paintings. The gold backdrop, similar poise. What is the revolution? Well, look more carefully at the Duccio. Do you see a few things that are very different? I think the art students here would see this pretty quickly. You see the balustrade at the bottom? That's not the frame of the painting. That's a balustrade. This is the first time in art that the artist, I call it the Emmanuel moment, where the artist is trying to bring us God on earth, God, Christ come to earth, and he's actually trying to paint for us something that happened here, not something going on up there. And the images have some shadowing to them. It's maybe early days for creating physical images that seem real, but certainly you can see more three-dimensionality here than you see in the Berlinguero on the other side. And the balustrade, we're actually looking in a window, maybe in Nazareth, at this interplay of Christ and Mary. And can you see how what started out as a purely symbolic explanation of the relationship between Christ and Mary in the icon, in this fashion, in Siena, Duccio is trying to capture the human interaction. You see Mary now considering, not symbolically, but like a human being would, what's going to happen here. And she looks down on Christ and she's imagining the future, not with fear. We talked about do not be afraid, right? But maybe with a little bit of anxiety at least, and a little bit of sadness even. And then that moment where the baby Jesus reaches up and touches Mary and says, Mom, it's okay. He comforts her. I'm here on a mission, you know? And it's that interplay that is the first attempt, or one of the very first attempts in Western art, of the artist to paint the soul of man, which I think is what you're doing in your work. And so here we are, this very early attempt and this revolution in this little period of 70 years from painting things entirely up there to painting God here with us and trying to get inside the soul of humanity. So I'm gonna let you take us forward now.
Sure. Well, I just adding to that, I mean, we're talking about prayer. I used to be an icon painter. I started as an icon painter. And one of the things about the theology of icon painting is actually it's icon writing. It's not actually painting. So it's written because there's a formula. And in a studio, an icon painting studio, a traditional icon painting studio, it would have been in a monastery. And in the monastery, you would have monks of different ages. And the most experienced monk would be doing the detailed work. So the novice would be doing maybe the lakes of color, which are this large blue part of the painting. That'd be one big lake of flat blue. And this would be one big lake of flat red. So those areas would be done by a monk who's been there for 10 years, but the person who's been there for only 5 years would actually prepare the wooden panel and do the gesso. And then the guy who's been there 15 years would start doing the details of the drapery and so on. And you notice that the light comes from the actual, the figures themselves. The light does not come from the outside, it comes from the inside. So it's an interior life that comes from the sanctity of the beings. The other thing is that as you get into the facial details and the real highlights, that is the monk who's been there the longest, 40 years or so. So it all emerges from prayer. They would pray these works into existence, and whole lives would go into these paintings. And it's not the painting, it's not the artist's painting, it's the painting of the whole community. So it's a very different way of approaching.
Yeah, inspired by the Holy Spirit.
Absolutely.
It's almost the Holy Spirit's painting.
Yeah,
or writing.
Exactly, and there's no signatures either.
Yeah.
The signatures come in the Renaissance when Michelangelo, for instance, did the Pietà, or as Jordan Peterson calls it, Pieta. He has the Michelangelo Fiorentino Fece Test. Michelangelo the Florentine made this. Basically, he really regretted that because he did that because they said that somebody else did it. So he signed it, and after that he never signed his work after that. But that was the time when, in the Renaissance, when artists started to sign the work. Before that, it was all done by individuals who were part of a community. Do you want me to move on to the next? Yeah. So the first work I was asked to talk about was this Pontormo. Now, you'll notice that on the left-hand side here, there's this Pontormo drawing, which is behind us on the wall here. that Pontormo drawing was from a drawing I was given access to the Gabinetto di Disegni in the Uffizi gallery. And this drawing was a major discovery for me, because what it portrayed very effectively was how art went from the paintings we saw just now, this very Byzantine spirituality, which is really the fourth dimension. People think it's very flat, it's only two dimensions, but it's actually the fourth dimension, it's the divine, supernatural dimension. But what happened in the Renaissance is we moved towards this Christian humanism, which was basically based on the ideas of St. Francis of Assisi. So St. Francis of Assisi was really the father of modern Western culture, because what he did was he started to focus on the humanity of Christ rather than the divinity. Obviously, the divinity was very well established in Christian theology, which we've just seen in the icons previously. But what St. Francis's charism was to focus on the humanity of Christ and the Christos suffering, the suffering of Christ. So that's why it was at that period in Franciscan spirituality we were introduced to the Presepe, the crib, the crucifixion, Christos sufferens, Christ suffering on the cross, the Via Crucis, the way of the cross. These were all Franciscan inventions. And that brought us into the humanity of Christ. And that profoundly influenced the most prominent artists of their time, Giotto in painting and Dante in literature. And if you think about it, those two artists transformed Western culture. So it all goes back to St. Francis. So it's quite exceptional to think about that. And what happened in the Renaissance is you have Michelangelo really bringing this to a climax in his work. And then after that you have Del Sarto, his student, and then Pontormo, the student of Del Sarto. And this is the work of Pontormo, who is a student of Del Sarto, who is a student of Michelangelo. And here Pontormo is bringing us back into the supernatural in a very elevated way. So what he's doing is he's taking this figurative work, this bone structure, muscle structure, very carnal reality, and he's bringing that back into the supernatural. And he's abstracting those forms in a supernatural way. So if you look at the next drawing I did beside that, this is the skeletal drawing here, which I superimposed on the wall here. You'll see that by studying the bone structure, I've been able to illustrate how he's abstracted it. Now, if we look to the three drawings on the right-hand side of the photograph, these ones that are on the wall here, this was the start of the discovery, because when I was given Beato Angelico's studio by the Dominicans in San Marco, this was the first time I had a decent-sized studio. And so I decided I was going to do something that I really needed to do, which was to experiment and really discover what was it that inspired Pontormo. So this was a pure experiment. I had no idea what I was going to discover. So the first way I approached this was to take my New York Academy training, which was very scientific reductionist. So I basically took the skeleton, I did a drawing life-size from the left, from the side, from the back, and from the front. And then I put a transparency on top, and then I superimposed the musculature from origin to insertion of every muscle. And then I decided to color code them so that they would be super easy to understand for artists, so that you're not so intimidated by all the Latin. So what I decided to do is break it down into complementary colors. So red is for flexors, green is for extensors. So the red, the extensors pull the full leg out, and the flexors pull the leg back. And you notice that the red and green complement each other as colors, but they also complement each other as actions, and that's how we stand, by the tension of the two. Then I decided to do another complementary group, blue and orange. So blue is abductor, to take away, abduct, alien abduction, and then orange to adduct, to bring in. And the combination of those two muscles help us to lift our arms up and our legs away from the bodies. And then the last group is our rotators, so they're yellow. So they're all the muscles that rotate our body. So the idea here was to really make it easy for an artist to see what's happening in a body when you understand the groups. Not necessarily individual muscles, but the group actions. So from that formation, I decided to use that scientific reductionist grammar to approach a mystical work of art. So as you see here, I'm taking this mystical image by Pontormo, which is the angel Gabriel in the Annunciation. Now think of the theological significance of that. This is the most sacred moment in history. The Annunciation, God becoming man. So if this is the most supernatural event in history, this calls for a tremendous abstraction, a supernatural abstraction. So what does Pontormo do? If you take this scientific grammar, you analyze this mystical work, what you do is you extract, you do an X-ray of the drawing. That's what I'm doing in this drawing up here with the bone structure, is pulling the bone structure out, and you see how he abstracts the body. So the body is dancing. You can see the way the bones are moving. It's like he's dancing. And you also see the chest is twice life size because he's inhaling the Holy Spirit. It's the breath of the Holy Spirit. You also notice that when you put the other transparency on top, you get this, this transparency was put on top of the bone structure to pull out the muscle structure, as we did here. And you notice the abstraction of the muscle structure in that drawing behind there. That the avambraccio, the upper arm and the lower arm, are quite abstracted there. He exaggerates the anatomy. And that's a mannerist abstraction of the form, which communicates a deeper spirituality and grace. Then you notice that even in the drapery, the third drawing here, the drapery is also abstracted. It's not just drapery drooping with gravity, but it's also billowing with the Holy Spirit. Okay? So when I did this, I discovered that, wow, Pontormo is abstracting every level of grammar, artistic grammar. The bone structure is abstracted, the muscle structure is abstracted, and the drapery is abstracted to communicate a deeper supernatural reality. Okay? So this was a real discovery to me to actually see this in a scientific way. So what I'm doing here is I'm separating the water from the oil, as it were, in a very clear way. And this was very clear to my students, because one of these students actually converted to Catholicism. And as we were coming out of the Duomo, after his baptism by the Archbishop, I asked him, what was it that made you want to do this, to become a Catholic? And he said, it was that 5-minute demonstration that made him realize, I have to be Catholic if I'm going to create beautiful work like Pontormo. So that was a real eye-opener to me, because 13 of those students have now converted to Catholicism. And it's all through this understanding. And the reason I use this as a demonstration is because it's so clear, because we have very scientific reductionist understandings, and if you use that to illustrate supernatural realities, you can't argue it. It's like theology of the body, which I teach here as well with the students. It's one of those things, once you understand it with your own body, you can't ignore it. And it's there forever as a reference.
Yeah,
so,
and it kind of becomes the perfect synthesis, which is the heading of the chapter in my book that I think you really kind of related to, because you were sending me quotes from that chapter. It's the only chapter dedicated to one artist, El Greco, who is a contemporary of Pontormo's. And I remember that weekend, Dony, when you were sending me quotes, and it is like, I think writing a book in some ways is sort of inspirational. You don't always remember, did I say that? And there it is. And one of the things in there is talking about how El Greco was a synthesis of art's attempt to paint the supernatural while at the same time painting life here on earth, and the synthesis of the two, and his ability to transport us to heaven and back again, and but there's a quote in there about how, for me, El Greco paints from the inside out. He's painting the outside of man inside, and the inside of man, the soul, on the outside. And in a way, that's exactly what you're describing here in more technical terms, but that's kind of what's going on here.
Yeah, I mean, the
What
trajectory,
Pantone?
will I change the image to El Greco?
Yeah.
So the El Greco is coming from the same tradition. El Greco was an icon painter. That's why he's called El Greco, because he comes from Greece. The Spaniards call him El Greco. And he was an icon painter, so he had this deep supernatural reality. And then he moved to Venice.
To Venice. So he grows up. He grows up in Crete. So Crete was the refuge of the Byzantine artists that had fled from the fall of Constantinople in 1452. But it's under the protection of the Venetians. So you have this Renaissance art floating around in Crete, and these Byzantine mystics. And El Greco kind of grows up in that island gumbo. He goes to Venice and studies there for 7 years, and then comes to Toledo, where he's known as the Greek. And this is his last painting. Painted right. Actually, his last painting technically is the version of this that was painted above his tomb. So this was a study for his last painting, and it's called The Adoration of the Shepherds. I just mentioned that because I always think it's interesting. What were the last thoughts? I was like, where will I be at that point in my life, in my journey, if you will? And El Greco chooses this image of Christ coming into the world to the most humble, and you've got this wonderful sense of the world is dark, it's night, right? In some ways the world is a dark place today, people would say that, and it's Christ that lights the world. And his imagery here of the lamb, the slaughtered lamb, right? That's a reference obviously to his sacrifice and the salvation of the world through that. If we can brighten this up just a little bit, so this is a little bit so you can see what's going on. But I think, Dony, you can see how these images are very much like the Pantormo, where they're very spiritual images. They're not, they're elongated. They're kind of almost spirits in some ways, but with three-dimensional solidity. And they're here on earth, and the soul is coming out from them. What's really fantastic too, if you lighten it up a little more, can you see there's a reference, this image has another painting in it, sort of in the background. And at the time that El Greco was painting this, he was also painting another painting called The Opening of the Fifth Seal, which some of you may have seen. And I think that would be a fascinating painting to talk about. I can see you smiling because you know that painting. It was the inspiration of the Demoiselles d'Avignon by Picasso, right? And so these kind of modern images painted by a guy in 1610 near the end of his life. But Dony, can you see in that painting in the back, can you see the image from The Opening of the Fifth Seal? I know you're familiar with that painting. So you have, these are the martyrs that have been waiting for Christ's conquering of death to be allowed to, the seal is open to heaven and they're let in. And he's kind of referencing in a way through the lamb. Here we are at the birth of Christ. We have the lamb down here referencing the crucifixion, and then we have the resurrection and the whole point of the exercise, all here in this heavenly scene in some ways, but set here on earth.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. You mentioned about painting the soul. I think El Greco is the only artist who actually did paint a soul. He had the burial of Count Largues. It's near Toledo Cathedral. Beautiful, extraordinary painting. But he has the burial of this count, and you can see his soul. He actually paints his soul raising up to heaven. It just blows your mind. So it's basically it's almost like a child, but it's abstracted like a flame. very much like the rest of his figures. He just he paints that spiritual essence.
Yeah.
Also, you notice the icon painting that the light comes from the divinity. You can see how the light is coming from the divinity in this painting. All the light's coming from the Christ child. It's supernatural light. And of course, as you look
lighting
at this,
the darkness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as you look at this, you may not be conscious of that, but subconsciously you're absorbing this fact that the art is actually informing your prayer, informing your spiritual life, and his spiritual life is overflowing into his work. And that is overflowing into your interior life as you're praying with this image. And I think it's really important for forming artists who want to create art that will inspire and bring people to God. It has to overflow from their interior life. And that's why I think I was so gifted to have Beato Angelico's studio, because Beato Angelico was a saint and an artist. And I think that's for an interdisciplinary working together to actually produce some really interesting seminars and projects together.
Yeah, a synthesis,
Yeah.
if you will,
Yeah.
because it's not compartmentalized, even though that's how we've tried to go about things.
Well, this is very true. It's a Western problem of compartmentalizing everything. Even medicine is completely compartmentalized. Oh, I only deal with feet. I only deal with noses. No, but you miss the holistic understanding. So I think we need to, and that's one of the great things about universal, it brings everything together. And it gives us an understanding, a full holistic understanding of who we are. And that's why teaching art in the context of theology of the body, you have truth and goodness, which overflows in beauty. And that the students can not only learn a craft, but learn about themselves through their body, not just as a machine, but as a theology.
Yeah, we were talking about this, like your art is doing that, attempting to pull everything back together again. And in some ways, the pilgrimage to the museum was my own little spin at that. Like I felt if we really need to understand art and what these historians, artists were trying to do, you have to actually survey the entire attempt to do it from ancient Egypt right through the moderns. And that it's through that synthesis that you really see late at night.
So it was just, but it reminded me of a trip, one of the tours I gave in Rome. I used to live in Rome for a few years, and Larry Kudlow, the presenter, asked me to give a tour with his wife, who's an artist, and I thought it was really interesting. Judy, she's not Catholic, but he wanted me to share the Catholicism with her. It was fascinating to give that tour because we could start with like the Met. We could start in Egypt and work our way through Greece and Rome and understand the whole history of Catholicism, go through the Sistine Chapel, and then go into it was a preparation for this being exposed to the Blessed Sacrament.
Are you going to take us to St. Joseph?
Oh yeah, would you like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's next, isn't it? So this is St. Joseph. This is one I did here for the Catholic Information Center in Washington, D.C. So the reason I put this in here is just to help us understand that the sacred art is a living tradition. It's not something that's dead. It's something that's living. And this sculpture was a real revelation to me how it actually lives in a contemporary culture. Because I was asked to I did 2 sculptures for this client previously, and they were rushed, and I had to do them very quickly. So I didn't have a time to really live with the work and to breathe with the work and actually have it overflow from my interior life. But I said to the client, I said, look, if you give me twice the time, I'll give you 4 times the sculpture for the same price. I mean, it's a good deal, right? Yeah. So an American
kind
can't
of what I
beat
tell
it.
my interns over the summer.
So, but it gave me time to spend, 6 months with the sculpture in my studio. And in that way, I could really pray with the work and it could overflow from my interior life. And in this piece, it was inspired very much by St. Escriva's writings about St. Joseph being, that's St. Escriva, the founder of Opus Dei. He talks about St. Joseph being a young man. And it was a way of helping people realize that you can be celibate and young and give yourself to God. that's one aspect. And the other thing that it influenced me is that I was doing a lot of work with inner city kids in Dublin, Belfast, and in the Bronx. And the biggest thing I was encountering was this crisis of paternity, these kids growing up without fathers. So I thought it would be really interesting to use this opportunity to create an icon of paternity and use St. Joseph in that way, so as to create a St. Joseph that could speak to a new generation. So I did a young St. Joseph who was compassionate, strong, macho St. Joseph, but also compassionate and maternal, paternal and maternal. And it really spoke to a whole new generation, to the extent that when the priest was blessing the statue, during the Mass he said, I asked Dony to give me St. Joseph the worker, but I don't know what he's going to say. I said, gave me St. Joseph the biker. but it spoke to a whole new generation. And it does. And ever since, I've been hearing people all the time saying, oh, you did the St. Joseph. And the best compliment I ever got was, that sculpture broke my heart. And there's nothing more beautiful for an artist. When somebody says that about your work, you know you've arrived.
And Dony, you know, what I love about it is, in some ways, you can see it is in the heritage of the Duccio, right? You've got this relationship here between, a very human relationship between Joseph and Jesus, smiling up at Joseph, and Joseph looking down on him lovingly. I'm trying to go backwards. I don't really know how to do that, but...
and that goes all the way back to St.
We can go back to the Duccio quickly. One more. Yeah, on the right here, right? The relationship between Mary and Jesus.
Yeah.
And there's this connection that you have with these artists that's really remarkable.
Yeah, it's the overflow of your humanity.
Yeah.
The secret, I think, is to try and be as good a person as you can be. Just steep yourself in Christ, in your prayer, and that overflows.
He's the linking verb.
Exactly. It's the Logos, it's Christ.
Yeah.
It really brings it together.
I'm going to interject here. This is just fascinating. What a wonderful dialogue. I know that you want to take some questions.
Oh, yeah.
So let's take some questions from the audience. Are there any questions?
Oh, sorry.
Hello.
What's your name?
My name is Molly Starkenberg. I'm an art major here. And I just wanted to ask Dony to maybe explain his process of sculpting for those who might not know the process.
Oh, the process of sculpting. Well, for the bronze casting? Okay. Complicated, but I'll try and do it as quick as I can. Okay. So you make the sculpture. Let's say you're doing a sculpture of St. Joseph, and this is his arm. The first thing you do is you sculpt it in clay. Once it's done in clay, then you make a shim wall with like aluminum, as you say here, aluminum sheet all the way around. So you make this wall of aluminum. Then you pour rubber on the inside and on the outside, and that rubber takes all the detail, like the little the nails and everything like that. And it's also rubber so it can go into the undercuts. All right. Once that's done, on both sides, then you make a plaster jacket or a fiberglass jacket on top of that. Okay, so that holds the form. Rubber for detail, plaster or fiberglass for form. Once you've done that, then you open it up, you take out the clay, you clean it, and then you have a complete negative of the original fist. Then, like a chocolate Santa or an Easter egg, you paint wax on the inside so it's about that thick, all the way around. Then you close it, you close the seam, and now once that's done, then you have exactly that fist, which was clay, is now hollow in wax. All right? Once that's hollow in wax, then you invert it, you put rods of wax on the top, and then you make like a fiberglass or styrofoam cup on top, and then you invest the whole thing in ceramic shell, like the plates at home, all right? And the ceramic shell gets to about that thickness as well, and you keep dipping it until you get that thickness. Then you invert that, put it into a kiln, and you melt out all the wax, and you bake the ceramic, okay? So it's rock hard baked ceramic, and it's white hot, all right? Then you invest it in a sand pit, And then you pour molten bronze into that cup receptacle that goes down the rods and into the form. And then you take it out and you smash the shell off, and then you have a hollow bronze version of the clay. And then you do that with the whole body, and then you weld the whole thing together, and that's what you get. So that's a lost wax method. It goes right back to the Greeks.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much to both of you. Really, really appreciated your conversation. And a brief comment, I think of Ezekiel and the dry bones and how beautiful it is to almost partake in the way that God created people, and that it was step by step, and it was bones, and then, gradually in fleshing. So I think it's really beautiful. I have a question for you, maybe for both of you, but especially for you, Dony. Could you speak maybe to like the spirituality of creating art, how it maybe differs, maybe on the one hand to be able to perceive art and what that's like spiritually, and then on the other hand to become active agents in the process?
It's essentially, for me, it's an overflow of the interior life. So you've probably heard the expression, the apostolate is the overflow of the interior life. I mean, that's very much what Steve has come from, like with the Wall Street work and his previous book is fantastic. It's all about the apostolate. And the reason his apostolate is so effective is because it's the overflow of his interior life. And in that way, it's not propaganda. It's just like so attractive. The guy's on fire, He's going to set fire to the city, and that's what he did. So that's really the secret, is that overflow of the interior life. So the important thing, and the beauty of this is that this is not limited to just art. Everybody has the same thing, because there's nothing more important. There's no greater work of art, no greater masterpiece than a saint. If you think about it, all this goes back to St. Francis, for instance. He set fire to the world. He's still setting fire to the world. So one of the beauties of this is that each one of us, is called to be a masterpiece. Not of me, but of God. So, just think of how high we're called to be. So that's really where I get my inspiration. That's where Steve gets his inspiration.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the assumptions or theses behind the pilgrimage to the museum. It sets out saying, I'm going to presume that God is beauty and that he plants his image within all of us. And he gives all of us gifts, but artists like you all here have a special calling, a special talent to describe beauty. So if you kind of assume for a moment that all artists are actually seeking their creator in some ways in their art, even when they don't realize it. And that's what's so fascinating about going back to in the Pilgrimage Museum, there's lots of non-technically religious art at the beginning and at the end and in between at different times, but yet you can see God coming through the creation. And I always think that the artists that end up being happiest, like I think Dony, you strike me as a pretty joyful, I would call it joyful, are the ones that have found God through their art and are kind of true to it in some ways. I had a conversation on the plane up here today with a modern artist, and he saw me reading The Pilgrimage to the Museum. I was kind of going through some of the art that we were going to talk about today, tried to get my head out of Wall Street and into art, kind of reset. And he says to me, that like is really fascinating. And before we know it, I find out his whole story. And I could see it resonating with him, that somehow he is seeking God through his art, but maybe got lost along the way.
Yeah.
Which can happen, I think, to all of us, whatever our talent is. We misuse that talent, and we end up with a dissonance within us.
Yeah, well, that's a big temptation for artists. The beauty can distract you too much, and you don't see the creator, you just see what's created, and that's a problem. So it's really important to tap into your regular prayer. Like I try to get daily mass as a way of keeping that fire alive. And of course, prayer in front of the Blessed Sacrament is so good for that. because people are relying on your interior life to feed them. So if you're, it's like homiletics. If you're to write a great homily, you have to read great homilies, and you have to pray, and that overflows in your work.
We have time for one more question.
Well, not the students. I can ask it.
Hi, my name is Liam Jamalot. I'm a student here. I guess my question is for either of you. Do you think that the beauty of art can be explained in a more in a non-religious standpoint, or do you believe that the beauty of art is self-revealing and can only be explained through something such as a higher power or religion?
I suppose art is just, to me, it's something supernatural. I can't understand beauty outside of that. It just brings me to a deeper understanding of who I am and how I relate with the world. So I know people try and take God out of art, but you see what happens. It becomes really dark and really unpleasant. So I think it's really important to discover who you are, is to really steep yourself in beauty.
Yeah,
and be honest.
And modern culture tries to sanitize God out of the art. It's one reason my wife and I wrote The Pilgrimage to the Museum, and we do these tours on Friday nights. The average person going to the Met, it's got the audio tour with God sanitized out. They can last about 45 minutes before they start just glazing over. But no one leaves after 45 minutes because people would see them, they're like a bore, you can't. And so they go another 45, okay, an hour and a half. And, you see people following us around the museum. Our pilgrimage takes 3.5 hours. And people end up tagging along with the group. And they literally are gripped. Because when you bring God back into it, which of course he's in it, that's when everything comes alive and it all fits. Yeah. And it's not just, another history lesson.
That's a very important point. I was giving a tour of the Sargent show in the Met, or in the National Gallery recently. I started with 10 of the students who were here, and ended up with 40 people at the end of the tour, including the curator of the show.
Exactly. We have the guards following us around, and it's like, well, weren't you supposed to be over there?
It was so much fun, so much fun. But it reminded me of Florence. The reason the Cardinal asked me to found the school was not just to teach the students in Florence, but also to create an interpretive center for the great works in Florence, because it's so tiring to be drawing in and studying these great works in Florence and hearing these, excuse me, but the Harvard professors and explaining the artwork with total absence of God, completely missing the point. So part of this idea of the school in Florence was to be an interpretive center for the city, and to make the traditional sacred art a live tradition moving forward. Forward and Tradition is the name of the school. The subtext, which is inspired by Ratzinger's Spirit of the Liturgy. So moving forward in tradition is that conflict, it's that tension that creates great culture. You steep yourself in the culture and you have the courage to move forward. It's a bit like the sanctity. It's fallen nature aspiring for the divine. It's that tension that makes great humanity, and it's forward in tradition that makes great art.
Well said.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much to Dony McManus and Steve Auth. Please join me in a round of applause. We are all better off for having been here today to hear both of them in their conversation. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to our audience in person. Thank you to those of you who have joined us online. And we wish you a blessed evening. Good night. Okay. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you.